You know, Sans said, twirling noodles around his fork. I gotta level with you, bro. This might be the best thing you've ever made.
Papyrus glared down at the mess on his plate. But I didn't do it right. He couldn't quite get past that. He'd screwed up the recipe, so by rights this should be the worst thing he'd ever made. But Undyne had liked it very much, and Sans had taken a larger portion than he usually did. Suspicious, Papyrus gathered some of the ruined spaghetti on his own fork, spearing a bit of tomato doubtfully. Chewing hurt, but if he took very small bites he could manage. The taste of it caught him so off guard he might have choked if it were anatomically possible. "It is good," he said, taken aback. "Better than usual, even."
Sans shrugged. "Guess you're such a good cook, messing up just improves it."
"I guess so. But I don't understand," Papyrus said, pushing slices of accidentally sautéed carrot around his plate. "I didn't follow Undyne's recipe correctly at all this time."
I keep meaning to bring it up," Sans said. "But Undyne might not be the best person to teach cooking lessons, bro."
"What makes you say that?" Sans got that slightly blank look on his face that meant he was trying to find a diplomatic way to word whatever he was about to say.
"Well, for starters, she only knows how to make one thing."
That was true. Papyrus had never really considered the fact that each lesson was about the same. He liked spaghetti a lot, so it felt sensible to make it as often as possible. "Well, it's important to master the fundamentals."
"I can't speak to that," Sans said. "But you have to admit your lessons also end with you guys putting out a kitchen fire a little too often. That can't be normal."
Another good point. Papyrus had always chalked that up to Undyne's fancy stove being defective. After all, he'd never set anything on fire in his kitchen. Of course, Undyne wasn't in his kitchen either.
I'm not saying you should stop doing lessons with her or anything, Sans said, between bites. "You guys have fun, right?" He waved a hand. "Fiery doom aside."
Papyrus nodded. He and Undyne hadn't cooked together in quite a while, come to think of it. He missed just hanging out with her. Now that he was in the Royal Guard, she was more captain than friend. Which was appropriate. But this afternoon had been nice, once the dust had settled. She'd helped shake him and Sans out of that weird apprehensive mire they'd been, well, mired in.
"Hey, here's an idea. We should make something tomorrow, since you'll be stuck in the house anyway."
Sans leaned back in his chair, the lights of his eyes twinkling slightly.
"Dare I say it? Maybe even something that's not pasta? The possibilities are nigh limitless."
He made an expansive gesture that threatened to overbalance him, but he caught himself. That actually sounded like fun. Especially when it was so rare that Sans wanted to do much of anything. That was even better than normal, even now that normal had been elevated to the level of an unattainable ideal. How could he say no? Papyrus didn't bother to question whether Sans intended to report for work tomorrow, or any time in the near future for that matter. He found he didn't much care. Undyne would understand, if she even noticed Sans' absence. "As long as it's not one of those awful sugary quiches," Papyrus said. Sans chuckled, and blinked as though surprised at himself.
"It wasn't a quiche, bro, and you didn't even try it. You would have liked it if you tried it."
That was unlikely, but Papyrus wasn't going to say so.
"I know you're gonna go stir-crazy in here while you're climbing Mount Paper, but this might be kinda..."
Sans' grin slipped as he trailed off. All four legs of the chair rested on the floor again.
"Listen," he said. "About today, with Undyne. don't tell her about all that stuff, okay?
I won't, Papyrus said. He frowned, feeling the awkwardness creeping back in like a curtain drawing closed between them. I'm not going to throw you under the bus just because I feel guilty. And he did feel guilty. Undyne had tried to play it off as a minor offense. But he could tell he'd cut her. Colluding with his brother to lie to her face like that. He was hiding things on multiple levels now. It was getting complicated. And the more complicated it got, the more likely it was that he'd make a mistake. He pushed his plate away. He wasn't hungry anymore. San shook his head.
I don't care about that. If Undyne has a bone to pick with me, I got 200 of them she can choose from.
He paused out of habit, but kept on when the groan never happened.
To be honest, I don't care what she thinks of me. I just don't want you to lose this job.
Was Sans, of all people, telling Papyrus not to quit? That felt weird. I'm not sure what you mean, he said. He stood, collecting their plates. Sans followed him to the kitchen.
I'm just saying,
Sans said, leaning against the counter while Papyrus put the leftovers away.
Quitting won't fix anything. It might feel good for a few days to not have that obligation hanging over you. But after that wears off, you'll feel even worse. I know you. You're not wired for unemployment, bro.
Papyrus sighed, focusing his attention on finding a free spot in the fridge for the container. I just don't know if this is a good idea anymore, he said. I have to consider everyone around me, not just what I want. He didn't even know what he wanted anymore. Or he knew he couldn't have what he wanted. Nothing can make all of this unhappen. He couldn't go back to the life he'd had before.
He'll still exist, with or without a job,
Sans said quietly. Papyrus looked up to find him hunched over slightly, arms wrapped around himself.
God, I hope this shit doesn't run in the family or something, he muttered.
What runs in the family? Papyrus said, belatedly realizing he was still holding the fridge door open. He shut it.
Nothing.
Sans flinched under Papyrus's sharp glare.
I mean,
he said.
You know.
He gestured at his own head.
The bad brain, stuff.
What did Sans mean by... Oh. Right. I hope not, he said, for lack of a better response. Papyrus knew why he felt the way he did. It wasn't anything he'd inherited, not that Sans could know that, or could ever know. But did that mean Sans had been hit with his so-called bad brain stuff out of nowhere? At least Papyrus had something to blame. He couldn't even imagine what it would be like to feel his soul going numb without even knowing why. I'm sorry, he said. The words felt small in his mouth. Every day was bad. For how long? Why? Sans glowered at the linoleum floor.
Quit apologizing so much. It feels weird.
Papyrus caught himself just before saying sorry again. They stood there for a moment, neither of them feeling very motivated to move or speak, pretending silent kitchen hangout time was a normal occurrence.
Unrelated to anything in particular, Sans said, gathering himself. I was wondering how long you've been able to summon that attack.
He wouldn't look in Papyrus's direction, much less make eye contact. Papyrus rubbed absently at his jaw. It was a little better, but dinner had aggravated it. Which attack?
The one you shook off.
Sans plucked at the drawstring of his hood.
You know, when... after I shoved you.
Oh. Papyrus stood up straighter, fighting the urge to slouch. He wanted to crawl into a dark hole, but there wasn't one handy. I didn't see it. Was something wrong with it? Now that he thought back to last night, not that he wanted to, whatever that attack had been had pulled hard on him, drawing more magic from his soul than a single attack really ought to. Sans looked up at him.
You didn't even look?
I was more concerned with not letting it go off, Papyrus said. They spent several seconds examining the floor. Who'd decided these colours looked good together anyway? Finally, Sans coughed.
It was sort of a...
He raised his hands to his face and couldn't seem to decide what shape to make with them.
Like a... you know...
He settled for making vague antlers with his fingers and opened his mouth in a sad little roar. Or maybe it was a burp.
You know,
he said. What did any of that nonsense mean? Sans, Papyrus said, crossing his arms and voice dripping pure bafflement. I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Could you try using words?
Like,
Sans said, smiling tense and brittle.
Like a skull. Like a messed up kind of animal skull.
Papyrus blinked. I don't have an attack like that, he said. He was sure he'd know by now if he could shape his bone attacks into skulls. I have the same attacks you have. The magic manifested in very similar ways, as was to be expected. Even unrelated monsters of the same type had a lot of shared attacks. Each brother had his own style and proficiencies, but the attacks themselves were nearly identical. Sans laughed, but he didn't sound very amused.
Don't know what to tell you, bro. I know what I saw. He shrugged. I was staring right at it. It was staring right back, even.
His smile looked pinned on, stiff and mirthless. How was that possible? Magic didn't just take on new shapes willy-nilly. Not that I don't believe you, Papyrus said, marveling at this new level of disturbed he'd managed to reach. But are you sure? It was only there for a second. Maybe it was just malformed. He hadn't consciously formed that attack after all, and a lot of his attacks last night had been unfinished and messy.
I wish,
Sans said ruefully.
No, I saw it clear as crystal.
Maybe this was what cold felt like. Do you know what it is?
Never seen it before in my life,
Sans answered, just a little too fast, hardly waiting for Papyrus to finish his question. He looked Papyrus in the eye socket when he spoke, face a bland mask.
I was just curious, that's all.
Then why had he seemed so... Something didn't sit right about Sans's behaviour. Just as Papyrus was starting to get better at lying, he was getting better at spotting when he was being lied to. It hasn't even been one day, Papyrus said, unable to keep some of the bitterness from creeping into his voice. He'd thought they were on the same team again. This was beyond exhausting. Can't we just skip all this for now? Sans sighed.
Right,
he said.
Maybe this isn't a good time.
The echo of Papyrus's own weak excuse slipped in between his ribs like a knife, intentional or not. I think, Papyrus said, after a long, uncomfortable pause. I think I'm going to go to bed. I'm tired. Sans nodded. Papyrus passed the rest of the evening in his room trying to rest. He chatted intermittently with Alphys about inconsequential things. Undyne had made it back apparently, and was sleeping after the requisite admonishment about sneaking out. Papyrus couldn't picture the soft-spoken reptile really scolding anyone, but the idea of worrying her was probably enough. Undyne put her all into her friendships, and she and Alphys were good friends. He knew nothing about the human TV show Alphys was talking about now, but it was a distraction, and that was all he was after. She could probably tell that he was just agreeing with her criticisms without really comprehending what she was saying, but she didn't call him out on it. She was very nice. When the time came, he messaged her to say he was going to bed and shut down his computer. The house was quiet. Not that Sans was ever all that loud. Papyrus cracked the door, peering out into the dark. The TV and all the lights were off. He couldn't hear any signs of movement. Quietly, he crept down the hall to Sans's door and listened. Silence. No light under the door. Papyrus slipped downstairs, successfully skipping the creaky step. He shut the front door behind him carefully, with only a soft click of the latch to give him away, if anyone had been awake to hear it. The night air was cold and still, but of course it didn't bother him. There were never many people about at this time. Snowdin didn't have much of a nightlife to speak of, and everyone was either at home or at Grillby's. Papyrus skirted around the edges of town regardless. He couldn't risk being seen by anyone. Everyone in Snowdin was his responsibility, and he would keep them safe. No armor? Papyrus shuffled in the snow. The loose, long-sleeved t-shirt and ratty jeans were a far cry from the armor Flowey was used to seeing him wear. The shirt was well worn, and had the word Angel blazoned across the front, with horns sprouting from the A, and a long pointed tail extending from the L. No doubt some human joke, rendered meaningless down here. I'm off patrol for a while, Papyrus said, hugging himself though the chill couldn't be affecting him. It'd look strange to wear it. I suppose we'll have to make do. Flowey could always reload if something happened, though he didn't anticipate that being necessary. Papyrus's defenses had improved immensely. It was his offense that needed work now. He still wasn't aggressive enough. Say, he said. We were interrupted this morning. There's something I wanted to ask you. Flowey rustled his leaves, looking up at Papyrus. You remember what we were discussing, right, friend? Papyrus nodded. Between the rumpled clothing and all the scuffs and bruises, he looked extra pathetic, all slumped like he was trying to make himself smaller. What would Sans do if you died, Papyrus? That got through the fog. Papyrus's spine snapped straight, and he took a step back. What do you mean? I mean what I mean, friend, Flowey winked. Papyrus wasn't as skittish as he used to be, but he was plainly freaked out. I know you've been thinking about the opposite all day, but that's kinda selfish, isn't it? After all, his troubles would all be over. But golly, Flowey went on. What if a human fell down and you couldn't beat them? What if something happened to you, huh? The look on Papyrus's face spoke better than words that he'd never considered this before. He frowned, opening his mouth to say something before changing his mind. Flowey gave him a moment. It's tough to think about this kind of thing, isn't it? Especially if you've never died before, he said, with a wry smile. Sometimes I forget that I have a better grasp on mortality than most people do. Papyrus kept quiet. Perhaps he thought it was a rhetorical question. Well, he wasn't wrong as such. Flowey would have enjoyed hearing his thoughts on the matter, actually, but he wasn't in the mood to push for it. You don't know? Flowey giggled. Hesitantly, Papyrus shook his head. Well, I bet I can guess, Flowey said. You know what Sans would do if you died? I'll tell you. He waggled his leaves in what he judged to be a decent approximation of jazz hands. Nothing! Papyrus blinked, twisting the hem of his shirt in his hands in a childish gesture of discomfort. Don't take that the wrong way now. He didn't need or want to listen to Papyrus defend his worthless brother. I don't mean he wouldn't be sad. I just mean that he'd do nothing. Flowey did a little dance on his stem to amuse himself. He wouldn't go to work, wouldn't leave the house, wouldn't clean or cook or take care of himself. Gee, Papyrus was quiet tonight. He just stood there listening, staring in Flowey's direction without quite focusing on him. Flowey went on with his list. It was fun to say out loud, had a sort of rhythm to it. He wouldn't talk to anybody, or answer the phone, or the door, or anything. He stopped trying and stopped caring about anything at all. He'd just stop, and he wouldn't ever start again. It was funny because it was true. That's why you shouldn't pin your happiness on another person, he said. Because when they're gone, you're left all alone forever, and you have to deal with it. Or not. He shrugged. Just as Flowey was starting to get annoyed at Papyrus's silence, the skeleton piped up. Why do you say things like this? You know I'm right, don't you? You do. Papyrus gave him a wounded look. He nodded slowly. Flowey grinned. That's right! You're the only reason he even gets out of bed. It's unhealthy if you ask me, he said. But I guess I'm not in a position to judge. Papyrus looked dangerously close to tears. He was so emotional. Don't be a crybaby, Papyrus, Flowey said, gently scolding. I'm only trying to motivate you. This is why you need to keep getting stronger, right? Papyrus nodded, sniffling. I'm not going to attack you this time, friend. We're going to try something new. Now he would find out just how well Papyrus could follow directions. I want you to attack me with everything you've got, okay? I won't counterattack or anything, so it'll be easy. I can't do that, Papyrus said, without much conviction. Flowey sighed. Of course you can, Papyrus. You know I can take it, and I can't really feel anything anyway. He blinked up at Papyrus, frowning. You want to get control of your magic again, don't you? Papyrus rubbed at his hurt arm. Yes, of course, he said. I don't know how beating you up is supposed to help. Gosh, he could be a dummy sometimes. Because, silly goose, Flowey said patiently. Up until now, you've been reacting to me attacking you, right? Defending yourself. If you're just reacting to things, you're not really in control, are you? So you gotta start making decisions again. That's the way I see it. Do I have to? Flowey rolled his eyes. Well, that was better than an outright refusal at least. You know the answer to that one, Papyrus. He smiled, showing teeth. Remember, I'm the one who says when we stop, and you should probably start before I lose my patience. Like a light switch being flicked on, the familiar will-o-wisp fire caught alight in Papyrus's hands. Rather than having to muster it, it seemed that the skeleton had been spending effort to keep it in check. Perhaps last night's light show had bled off enough pressure that Papyrus had bought himself time to regain some measure of control, though how much and for how long remained to be seen. As amusing as his little meltdown had been, Flowey was pleased that Papyrus was adapting so quickly. Maybe he wouldn't be one of the monsters who broke into a million pieces. So far, everything they were doing was simply the crucible making him stronger, tempering him. Flowey felt a facsimile of pride as the first wave of attacks hit him. He was pretty good at this whole coaching business. Papyrus was getting better at doing as he was told. Grim misery etched on his face. He nonetheless ran through each of his attacks, progressing in strength and complexity. Without having to split his attention or dive around the clearing, he could focus on his attack patterns fully, and it showed. As the session wore on, Papyrus's grimace faded into a look of detached concentration. Flowey's leaves hung in tatters from an equally damaged stem, and several petals lay scattered in the snow. He hadn't bothered to expose more of his form than the top couple of feet, which left him a rather small target to hit, but Papyrus was doing well. He lay staring up at the distant ceiling for a moment, knocked over by a strong wave of bones. Straightening up, Flowey couldn't help giggling. One of his teeth had been knocked loose. He rolled it around in his mouth and spat it out into the snow like a dart. This, at last, made Papyrus pause. The wave sliding toward Flowey halted when he raised his hand, but didn't dissipate. For a few seconds he didn't say anything, just looked at Flowey with that closed-off expression. "Problem?" Flowey asked, testing out his new gap-toothed grin. "You're doing a good job, Papyrus." Papyrus frowned, brows knitted. "If you are who you say you are," he said, "I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" The bone waves rolled back and forth slowly, huge pendulums stirring up the snow. Flowey raised a ruined leaf to his ruined petals, patting them thoughtfully. That wasn't a question born of panic. It was genuine confusion and interest. "I guess I did say I'd tell you, huh?" He smiled. "Because you're my friend, Papyrus," he said. "I like you. You're my favorite." "That's not much of a reason," Papyrus said. The waves undulated from side to side, ready to continue on their course at a moment's notice. "I disagree. It's the best reason." Flowey extended a single vine to pick up his discarded tooth. He held it up, examining it. It was sharp and pollen yellow. "I don't want you to be a victim," he said. "I want you to be stronger than I was, and get the ending I should have gotten." He wanted to see that ending. He'd never seen an outcome like that, where Papyrus triumphed. It would be a good ending. Satisfying. For a time, anyway. And that was all Flowey could ever hope for. He'd seen Papyrus reap the rewards for his naivety enough times that Flowey was thoroughly bored with the entire concept. No. Killing Papyrus, no matter how drawn out or creative the process, was passé. Even the most outrageous things Flowey could think of to inflict beforehand resulted in only a minor blip of momentary interest. At a certain point, it was just too much work for too little payoff, when every death boiled down to the same intersection of misdirected mercy, blind faith, and the literally fatal flaw of having more compassion than sense. The same exhortation to do better in the future, to be kinder. even as the soft-hearted idiot crumbled to dust. Any hint of transgression or guilty pleasure, as though he could feel either guilt or pleasure, had long since faded out into the flat grey of repetition. The first few times had been difficult, despite a lack of any capacity for emotion. After that, Flowey had found it funny. Once the joke got stale, it made him angry, in his dull and empty way, until even that drained away into grey, grey, grey. Flowey had gone back to making friends instead. A palate cleanser, a too little too late attempt at fighting the tide of desensitization, and recently even that had begun turning to grey mush like everything else. But seeing Papyrus, dopey, lovable, harmless Papyrus, become something different, something sharp-edged and strong and cool, someone who could kill rather than meekly be killed, Flowey hadn't seen that yet. He wanted to see something new. It would be almost like a feeling, and Papyrus was still his favourite toy, boredom aside. His favourite was still maintaining that attack, bones held suspended but ready to rush onward as soon as Papyrus let the leash slip. "I don't understand," Papyrus said.
"One day you will," Flowey said. "I don't think I could explain it fully if I wanted to. And I don't really want to, Papyrus. I want you to trust your best friend."
An odd look passed over Papyrus's face at that, like he'd mistaken vinegar for water. It was gone in a second. Flowey giggled. There had been a time not long ago when Papyrus would have wept tears of joy to hear that anyone considered themselves his best friend.
"You may proceed, friend."
With a defeated sigh, Papyrus lowered his hand, and the bones lurched into motion again. It took longer than usual for Papyrus to reach the point of exhaustion. Not surprising, considering he was standing still and not taking any damage himself. He spent the last half hour or so sitting in the snow while he directed increasingly slapdash attacks. At last, with a final clumsy tumble of bones that collapsed long before they could do any damage, Papyrus stopped. Flowey watched the skeleton shaking in the snow with his one usable eye, wondering if Papyrus were truly spent. Well, he had said that he wouldn't attack tonight. He supposed he could save that for another time.
"You did very well, Papyrus,"
he said, with a smile that had a few new gaps in it.
"That wasn't so bad, was it?"
"Can I go now?"
"Aww."
Flowey's face fell.
"You don't have to leave just because practice is over."
What was Papyrus's hurry to get back to his stupid house that was hard to see inside of anyway? As if he wasn't going to spend enough time in there.
"We can hang out for a little while, huh? Like we used to. You should take a break before you walk back to town."
Papyrus drew his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around his legs. He didn't argue, just sat and sulked. Minutes ticked by. Flowey made a design on the ground with his lost teeth and petals.
"So,"
he said brightly,
"did you do anything fun today?"
"No." Flowey frowned, to his own surprise. He hadn't heard Papyrus chatter about his daily life since he'd started their training regimen, and he was finding that he missed it. Forcing Papyrus to talk wouldn't be the same. Well, this was just more novelty in the end. That was the point of the whole run. And this newfound reticence made Papyrus more mysterious, and mystery was one thing that was always in very short supply. He couldn't complain, really.
"If you ask me a question," Flowey said, "and I like the question, then I'll let you go home. Does that sound fair, friend?"
Papyrus seemed to mull the offer over for a moment, arms folded over his knees, glaring at nothing. After his deliberations were over, he said, "What was the surface like?" That wasn't the sort of question Flowey had been expecting. He laughed. Papyrus could always surprise him.
"I was only up there for a few hours," he said, shrugging. A handful of leaves fell to the ground. "And it wasn't exactly a pleasant nature hike."
He had carried his sibling's body back to their village, back to those damned flowers. A human soul had blazed in him like a star, like a nuclear reactor. Grief and wonder and fear had kaleidoscoped through and around him, and then he had died alone. How had he ever been so full, to be so empty now? "I've only ever seen pictures," Papyrus said, his glare softening. "In magazines and things." Flowey didn't think about the surface very often. It was pointless. Most monsters were somewhat obsessed with it, but then the underground was a small world after all.
"It's really open," he said. "The air feels different, and there's no walls or ceilings. It's scary at first. You feel really exposed and small."
He couldn't feel that kind of fear now, but he remembered. Slowly, Papyrus relaxed, propping himself up with his hands, stretching his legs out in the snow. "It looks pretty in the pictures," he said.
"It is pretty,"
Flowey conceded.
"The sky is..."
The sky was hard to describe, he was finding. It had been so long ago, but he remembered staring at the sunset, utterly transfixed. He'd already been crying, but seeing a sight like that, knowing that this was the world his sibling, his best friend, had lost, would never have again, that they couldn't share this beauty, had made him cry a whole lot harder. He remembered sitting in the soft grass, his sibling's cool, still body cradled in his arms. He'd been unable to think, unable to process the magnitude of this world cruelty, howling agony as the sun receded beneath the horizon, taking the light away. Until the soul prodded and seared, and burned him back into motion, back to his task. Or perhaps it had just been hurting too. Flowey giggled, shook himself free of the memory.
"It's super pretty, obviously."
That was all there was to be said about it. Pretty, stupid, pointless.
"Stick with me, and you might even get to see it yourself one day,"
he said. If this run went just right, it was a definite possibility. Flowey could get hyped for the destruction of humanity at least a few dozen times before that got boring, he supposed. Papyrus made a non-committal sound. He yelped and scrambled backward when Flowey submerged to pop up at his side.
"Easy, Papyrus,"
Flowey tutted, halting the skeleton with a few vines.
"You didn't think I'd forget to heal you before you left, did you?"
Oh. Papyrus held still, save for the shaking that made him rattle softly. He winced as the cracks and bruises mended themselves in the wake of Flowey's healing spell. Flowey winked.
"There. That's better, isn't it?"
Papyrus nodded, rubbing his now intact jaw.
"So,"
Flowey said as Papyrus moved to stand,
"I'll see you tomorrow night."
Papyrus stiffened, but the tension receded just as quickly. "All right," he said. Flowey dismissed him and watched him go. It would be a long, shambling walk back to Snowdin. Once he was out of sight, Flowey turned his attention to the bits and pieces of himself that littered the clearing. He'd have to find something reflective to examine himself in before he healed. Goodness, but he'd taken quite a lot of damage. How wonderful. And tomorrow, they could do it all again.